Before the success stories, the progress, there was you. You who made a choice to grow, to inspire, to overcome your own challenges. At NASM, we're in service of your limitless potential because when you keep growing, we all get stronger, and we'll never stop making your journey our mission. Join the fitness leader. Become a fitness leader. Become a certified personal trainer.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on the Master Instructor Roundtable. I'm Master Instructor Marty Miller here with my co-host, fellow Master Instructor, but most importantly, dear friend, Miss Wendy Batts. Wendy, how's it going?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
Good. Looking forward to the topic. I'm always looking forward to the topics we bring out, but kind of bringing it back to the basics a little bit, bringing it back to what made NASM, or at least a part of it, as far as obviously we have the OPT model. But we really were early on adapters in this industry talking about the entire body, movement assessments, and that phrase or term, kinetic chain. And Wendy, I know you love the 5Ks. So we're going to jump in and dive into what the kinetic chain means. And most importantly, how you can think about things and use that in your everyday training and practice with your clients.
Absolutely. Well, this information can be found a lot on the NASM blog post section. So if you guys have not had a chance to go to nasm.org and check out the blogs, they put out some really good information that I think is helpful, especially to some of our newer trainers. And so, Marty, you and I always get the question, like, I don't really understand what the kinetic chain is. And I think it's easiest to say, basically, it's your entire body. It's from the floor up. It's talking about the toes all the way up to the hairs on your head. And so, again, this information can be detailed into some of the blogs that you'll see. We are going to review what the kinetic chain is. We're going to talk about the background and how it even kind of became part of our biomechanics and how we look at human movement science. And then we're going to talk about how it works holistically and the collection of all the body parts, starting at the foot and ankle and working all the way up to the head, and why we are so specific. And I don't want to say strict because that's not it, but we really want people to get into proper 5 kinetic chain alignment with the feet pointed straight ahead, the knees over the second, third toe, the hips in neutral, the shoulders in line with the hip bones if you're looking sideways, and then the ear in line with the shoulder. Because we start all of our clients this way, we want them to train this way. And hopefully by the end of this podcast, you're going to see why that is so important.
Yeah, without a doubt, excuse me, it's very important to look at the whole body. As an athletic trainer, when I went through school in the mid 90s, started my career late 90s, early 2000, we really, we thought we were advanced. It was a joint above and below the injury site. And that was the right approach to an extent, but it was very limited. Obviously, we have to look on the opposite side of the body and through the entire kinetic chain. Now, I was looking in treating injuries. This is not that as far as scope of practice, but in your fitness programming, you have to understand human movement and how something on the left side that's in contact with the ground can affect the opposite hip or opposite shoulder. So hopefully we'll dive into that today and give you a good understanding of the kinetic chain.
So this is the actual name to the blog post that we're referring to. And you're going to see Dana wrote a great article. She ended up going into a lot of detail. And once again, this is just one of many articles and blog posts that we put out. We have obviously research to support some of the content. And it does go along the lines of what we've learned as certified personal trainers or throughout the entire specialization catalog, if you will, that we have through NASM. So if you didn't know that that was available to you, you definitely want to check out our blogs. And you saw it on the last slide of exactly where to find that. However, just keep in mind, this is where we gathered a lot of this information, and that's what we're going to discuss.
So when I was looking into this, and this is right from Dana's, information, and then I went even a little deeper, the kinetic chain concepts, sounded new to me when I first heard it in the mid 90s, late 90s. But, on further review, the kinetic chain concept in fitness established, on mechanical engineering principles was introduced by Franz, I don't know how to pronounce that name. We're going to go with Rollo. A German engineer in 1875, right, describes how the body's joints and segments are interconnected during movement. And that makes sense to me that it would be an engineer that would understand what they had learned in building machines and things like that, and then watch human movement and understand it as well, right? So this idea highlights that movement in one body part can significantly influence other areas. So talk about being ahead of your time here in 1875.
I'm telling you, and nice job. I mean, you should go to Germany, because I think I looked it up, and that's how I was asking how to pronounce it on on Google, and I think you did a really good job. But this is like some of the work that you can find, and so you can look here. This work explores the kinematics of machinery. So again, think about the body and how it works. And he's the father of kinematics. So he writes with authority. His precision about his original and incisive ideas. This has actually led to us like knowing what we should and should not do with our clients. It helps us with proper alignment, proper movement patterns. And when we're really focusing on a prime mover, we want to get that prime mover to focus the way or fire the way that we want it to fire. And it really being what that exercise is about. If we start to feel synergist or things that shouldn't be working with the prime mover, then we know we have some compensation patterns we need to look into. So he begins the discussion of the nature of the machine problem. He advances the examinations of such topics. And so when we're looking at it again, we're looking at the elements, we're looking at the incomplete kinetic chains, we're looking at rotation and notation of all of this. And then we're trying to find out exactly, okay, if your body's not moving as ideally as possible, and we're starting you in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints, where did you start to go wrong? And so if you're looking for this type of information, you want to dive deeper into just the father that found and kind of brought forth kinetic chain, this is a great text for you to look into. It's a basic course, but it serves as a standard reference for all professionals, especially within our industry.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've been in this industry my whole career, 30 years now, and did not know where kinematics or the kinetic chain came from. And I remember explaining to people many times when talking with NASM or what we do with human movement is I would always say, well, we're the engineer for the human body. And lo and behold, did I not, know that that's really where it came from. So, it makes sense to me that an engineer would figure this out, but I had no idea, even though I had used that expression, that that's truly where it came from.
Well, that's why we do these podcasts. We learn a lot ourselves. So that's one of the reasons I love it. So when we talk about the kinetic chain, this, proposes the movement in one part of the body, and it's going to produce forces that are transmitted to other adjacent parts, creating the domino effect. And so this underscores the human body's interconnected nature and highlights how holistic approach and training can enhance movement patterns. So this concept is going to improve fitness recovery, lead to more comprehensive training routines, and boost fitness and sports performance. This sounds like something that you and I say all the time. But guys, we look at the foot and ankle first, because if we know that there's compensations at the foot and ankle, then we know there's going to be compensations throughout the entire kinetic chain, all the way up to, like you said, Marty, it could be our neck, it could be our shoulders, but it could stem from the foot and ankle lacking proper range of motion, which again, ideally is about 20 degrees of dorsiflexion. So when you're thinking about this, you've got to look at it scientifically. But then we know that if we're setting our clients up in the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints to start an exercise, we want them to be able to maintain that. And if they can't, basically this slide says it all. If we can't, then we know that they're having to recruit other muscles that should not be recruited at that movement or during that time, because we want to then say, okay, is the weight too heavy? Is the exercise too much? And we have learned through corrective exercise that by doing different mobility assessments and different testing, that if somebody is lacking range of motion when they're doing something like the overhead squat, but then we do some mobility testing and they have ideal range of motion, it's not necessarily overactive muscles that are restricting that movement. It's the weaker muscles that are allowing that compensation to occur. And so once again, when we're talking about kind of the history and the foundation parts, think about how it translated into what we're saying today and what you're reading in your education, to realize that we haven't changed anything. We're just trying to simplify it. So when you design a program, it's very individualized for that client based on their assessment.
Yeah, great points, Wendy. And I think the biggest thing, to me, the biggest takeaway is just simply the image on the right side of the screen here. So if you're watching, obviously you get to see it. If you're listening, it's a simple chain. and there's one chain in the middle that's broken and it's red, kind of like red alert, because you will only be as strong as your weakest link. And we've talked about that in all aspects of life. But this is hugely important in human movement. You cannot hide a compensation forever. You can kind of maybe for a bit period of time, but it's going to get worse, or when fatigue sets in, or when load moves to higher levels, or you now move at different speeds or in different planes of motion, that weak link will always show up. So just like anything else, whether you did a SWOT analysis and you understand that you need to time block better and that's your weak link or whatever it is, when we're talking about human anatomy or anything else in life, when you've identified a weak link, that has to be your focus. You cannot train beyond that or bad things will happen. Can't ignore it either. So this is the beauty of the kinetic chain. It helps us through movement assessments identify those weak links, and then through your corrective exercise strategy, and then into the integrated, first phase of stabilization endurance, that can address those weak links.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a good point, and I want to stress that too, that, we've seen stuff on our Facebook page. We've talked about this a lot. Guys, if somebody's doing an overhead squat and we're only having them do 5 squats in in each position, so from the front to the side and the back, and they're good at hiding a compensation, but you start to see minimum movement and you're like, I don't know if I should mark that down. You definitely want to, because as they get more and more tired, that compensation or that weakest link starts to really show. So even if it's slight during your assessments, you're going to make note of it, because you do want to work on that, because that is a weaker link where you're just starting to see some movement patterns that are not ideal. And so just remember, no matter what, always write what you see, even if it's minimal, because as they get tired, that will get worse.
Agreed. So for those of you just joining on today's Master Instructor Roundtable, Marty Miller here with Wendy Batts, and we're just taking a deeper dive into the kinetic chain. Understanding it started in 1875 as a concept, and obviously we're still using that concept today. So let's move forward here. So now when we look at the kinetic chain, this will explain why pain or discomfort might appear in a different area than one may have exercised previously. So I've always used the analogy of the victim and the robber, right? The victim and the robber are not always going to be in the same spot. So you may rob range of motion in your ankle, but the victim may be the low back or the hip. So that's where you can't chase pain when we look at these type of things. Now, remember, once again, we're not here to treat pain in our scope of practice. So we're talking about dysfunction, improper movement, or they may have some slight pain. Make sure they're medically cleared to do what you are asking them to do. But that's why you have to take that holistic approach. You have to look at the entire kinetic chain and don't zero in on where they feel something. You have to bring it back to human movement. So a few examples would be low back pain can originate from tightness in a seemingly unrelated area, not just lower back muscles, right? The hip flexors. Tightness in the feet or hip flexors can trigger low back pain. And then there's that importance of understanding the kinetic chain in effect to fitness recovery and overall body health. A body that moves well will recover well.
Yeah. And, it's interesting that you say this, Marty. I actually just worked on a tennis player today, and, he came in with low back pain. And again, low back pain playing tennis is a huge problem. And, he's like, I can't extend. He was having a really hard time extending. And those of you guys that play professional tennis or have even just played tennis in general, you know that you need your lat extensibility. And so if you're lacking that, you've got to think of where they go into the hips. And so I just started at his big toe. You guys know me in the big toe, but we looked at range of motion. He's negative in his ankles. He was negative in internal rotation. However, his hips, when you're looking at hip flexion, was actually really good, and hip extension was really good. And so I gave him range of motion back in his ankles. I gave him range of motion back in he was always also lacking knee extension. So gave him some better extension through the knee. And then we also looked at everything else that had nothing to do with the back, went into his lats, gave him, stretched his lats. And literally that's all we did. And then did some activation stuff, and his back pain was gone. He could extend, he could flex, but he was 3 on internal rotation on one side of hip and internal rotation, which 3 guys is not good. 45 is ideal. And so when you're just getting someone loosened up, meaning you're foam rolling, they're using a percussion device, and then you're activating the right muscles, his pain was in his lower back. I didn't touch his lower back. I touched everything else around it that was lacking range of motion. And then it took, quote, that pain away. So don't just look at where they're talking about. And that's one of the beauties of what we do is we look at everything, because everything that he was lacking, once we gave it back to him, it took that pain away because it was no longer force. There's tug of war going on throughout his body just to get that movement to produce. When if we got the right range of motion, the right muscles were firing, everything worked out great. And quote, his pain went away in one session. It's easy to do.
Crazy how that works out.
Crazy how it works.
So when we look at the kinetic chain, we can break it down, right? And so we took at the whole body approach. But if we look at the upper portion of the kinetic chain, this would include your upper body, such as your fingers, wrists, forearms, upper arms, shoulders, and shoulder girdle and spine, especially if you're looking at that thoracic spine. Then these parts of the body help with pushing and pulling movements and provide a wide range of movements powered by the shoulder girdle. And, I'm a big rotator cuff fan coming out of professional baseball and things like that. But you see everybody in the gym doing horrific rotator cuff exercises, but they're just attacking the isolated motion. You've got to get the soft tissue loosened up, sternocleidomastoid, scalenes. You've got to get thoracic rotation before you'd even think about activating your rotator cuff. So when you look at the sequence of events here, there's more to it than just, let's get your rotator cuff warmed up. Understand that whole shoulder girdle and shoulder complex. So the upper kinetic chain coordinates together for upper body movement. So all of our pushes, pullings, rotational type of exercises, there is a tie into the lower bodies. We get into those, but just wanted to identify just how we talk about the upper kinetic chain. Mm-hmm. Guess what's coming up next?
The lower kinetic chain. So here again, we're talking about the lower body, such as the toes, feet, lower legs, ankles, upper legs. I like how we call them upper legs, lower legs, hips, and pelvis. And these are often included in your major movements, such as walking, running, anything where you're touching the ground. So when your foot hits the ground and you're propelling forward, obviously all of those muscles that are going to be included in, as well as the core stabilizers, that's going to be huge in maintaining proper alignment within the spine. And this is, of course, going to play a really important role in your core stabilization, your forward movement, as I said, when you're walking and propelling yourself. So just, we wanted to identify the upper and the lower because we train it all together. However, you've got to look at it kind of maybe segmental to start to make sure too, that the right muscles are firing the way it's supposed to. They've got good range of motion. So then when your foot does touch the ground, we've got good activation happening from those toes all the way up.
Yeah. And a couple of weeks back, I don't remember the exact date, we recorded a podcast on barefoot training. You go back, look that up on the Master Instructor Roundtable, then tie everything we just taught you there back into this one. You'll find how important it is to get your foot functioning properly, activate it, take those shoes off, connect with the ground.
Become one with the ground.
Become one, yeah.
Go
ahead, Lynn.
I was just going to say, often, Marty, you and I hear people talk about open chain and closed chain exercises, and people sometimes get those confused. And so we wanted to pinpoint this, especially on today's Master Instructor Roundtable, talking about the kinetic chain with myself, Wendy Batts, and Marty Miller. But when we're talking about it, I think it's important for us to realize what an open chain exercise is. So if you're going back and you're looking at the slide, think about the definition of what it is. And then we're going to talk about some different exercises that we use when we're talking about it. So here it's where the distal or the part that's further from the center of your body. So the segment of the body is free to move around in space. So for example, if we're going to be focusing on, let's say, the quads, they might be doing a seated leg extension, or if we're doing a leg curl, we're going to be focusing on the hamstrings. But that foot is floating when it's in that type of machine. I personally don't use these types of machines as much unless I'm trying to build hypertrophy or work specific muscles because of just being in a machine, and I like to freely move. So I use cables very often. But then if you're trying to get more of a visual, and maybe you're not really familiar with machines, think about a bicep curl. So when the arm is moving in space, just going up and down, flexion and extension, those are examples of the open chain, kinetic chain movement patterns that we're talking about. So this is going to help focus on targeting specific muscle groups. And of course, that's going to be really important if you're a bodybuilder, or you're, like I said, if you're doing corrective exercise and you need to activate a specific muscles, these machines come in handy often. But then again, too, you also want to think how you can do it more in functional movements that are going to lead to everyday activities.
Yeah, just like everything has a place, there's times where you might need to activate a certain muscle if you're using a corrective exercise continuum. But the biggest thing is, are you doing far more open chain exercises? Do you include enough closed chain exercises? And really look at the balance there, especially with what phase of training you're in or what you're trying to accomplish. So now closed chain, this is going to be the opposite, right? Very simple. So this is where the distal segment of the body is fixed or in contact with a stable surface like the floor. So you'll see the picture here on the right. If she's doing lunges, it could be stationary, it could be walking lunges, etc. So performing body weight squats would be an example. This is the entire body working as one holistic movement where the feet are stable and fixed on the floor. Stationary lunges, body weight push-ups, forward or backwards lunges. Those are some examples of closed chain kinetic exercises.
You should do them both.
And then continuing on with closed chain. So this is where it can kind of get a little, I don't want to use the word screwy for people, but there's more to it here. So closed chain exercises include full body movements that play an integral role in functional movement and core strengthening. So you'll see this could be a high plank or a push-up. These type of movements help improve coordination for sure, balance, and work in multiple groups all at once. And like an example is a pull-up. A lot of people think it's an open chain exercise. It's actually a closed chain exercise because the distal part is fixed.
Yes, you're fixed on the bar, hopefully.
Well, no, at least until you're done.
So it's important to understand and optimize the kinetic chain and what its potential is, especially when you're working with your clients and you're thinking about proper movement patterns, athleticism, of course, and then your overall well-being. And so as we've explored interconnectedness, that's such a fun word to say, interconnectedness of joints and muscles, it becomes evident that a well-balanced and coordinated kinetic chain is essential for peak performance and injury prevention. Wow, it's like I've heard this before. Guys, Marty just said it, you're only as strong as you are stable, or you're only as strong as your weakest link. And so really when we talk about getting someone, having them into the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints to where that becomes a natural stance, a natural movement pattern, you're only going to help make sure that the joints themselves are in proper alignment. They're less stress. If you have your feet externally rotated, your knees are internally rotated, or you've got knee valgus, if your hips are not in neutral position, it's just putting a lot of excess stress on other joints that shouldn't have that type of stress. And that's what leads to that discomfort that we often hear from our clients. And so if we put them in proper alignment, we really do think about those 5 kinetic chain checkpoints and we train them that way, then their body and their brain and their muscles start to like move that way because that's what we're training. It's like a computer program. We've said this all the time. We're trying to enter good information in so we get good information out. And if we're just letting them stand in all kinds of weird ways, we're not really watching the kinetic chain, we're doing a disservice, I think, by really not focusing on slow and controlled movement patterns, making sure that it's intentional of whatever muscle the prime mover is, and that we're ensuring that whatever muscle should be firing is firing. And if we're doing multi-joint, that it's happening in the correct pattern.
Yeah, we're absolutely looking for quality over quantity. It's execution of perfect movement or near perfect movement for periods of time. And then from there, you build your foundation to where you can start to add load and then eventually start to add speed. So key takeaways. Wendy, you mentioned this at the very beginning. A lot of people may forget. We have a lot of resources for you where you can continue to gather information. So you see here, nasm.org/blog. That's where this information came from. So that's one reason. Outside, it was a great topic. We also wanted to sprinkle in, hey, don't forget to check out your resources. Then every single time you're training yourself, every single time you're working with your clients, think about not only the phase of training, not only the acute variables, look at the entire kinetic chain. It'll tell you a story. You will see where there could still be some hidden weak links, or when you bring in a new adaptation or that next level, sometimes that weak link then shows up. So you have to be aware and ready for it. And you've heard it here at least twice. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So that's the beauty of understanding the kinetic chain, looking at as a machine, like our forefather here in engineering back in Germany in 1875 pointed out, that we are a machine and that we're going to operate in a very similar way. And we have to be well balanced to give our best performance.
Well, and I also want to just say, because I think it's important. I know Marty and I are probably going to hear this after people listen to it. Guys, we're talking about proper movement patterns within the gym and when we're working out on trying to get our body working as properly and functionally as possible. So again, you may have changed your stance. You may do something completely different for a sport or some sort of lift that is for a sport, but this isn't, we're not talking about that. We're talking about when we're training for ideal movement patterns, really focusing on prime movers and trying to get the best execution. So just remember that this is not about sport. This is just how our body biomechanically should function. We're trying to get good range of motion. We're trying to keep our joints safe, and we're trying to decrease stress placed upon joints that should not be needed. But unfortunately, based on life and sitting and being in front of a computer, we know compensations occur. We're trying to help people get out of those compensations to feel better, to move better, and perform at their highest level. So I just didn't want to get emails sent, well, when I do my, I'm doing powerlifting for my school and my sport, like my feet have to be a certain way. I get it, but we're not talking about sport. We're talking about life.
No, great points. And we know, and we've talked about it, that when we do sports, we risk that, but being as balanced as you can when you're in the gym still carries over to help prevent those injuries in sport.
Indeed. Well, if you guys have questions, you can always find me at wendy.batts@nasm.org, or you can find me on Instagram at wendy.batts13. And
my information is popping right up here, right on cue. Instagram, dr.martymiller72. And then my email is marty.miller@nasm.org. So Wendy, great insights, great topic. Hopefully, I think we'll hear back from everybody. Maybe they'll want us to dig a little deeper on future podcasts, but we're here for you. Reach out anytime. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next week on the Master Instructor Roundtable.